Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, CG Wagner. This podcast is an extension of our work at LTS to support survivors of sexual violence with long-term care, community, and resources, all at no cost to participants. This month's episode is Wanna Be Friends? I was sitting at a two-top table outside under a live oak tree with one of my dear friends. It had been a particularly difficult few months for me in a situation that kept getting more challenging instead of less. It felt like a relentless burden, one that I didn't know how to improve. I sat at that table, trying desperately not to be the person crying in public again. And I was feeling guilty about how much of my friend's time I had taken up with this cyclical conversation about a circumstance that didn't seem to be going anywhere. So I apologized for taking up so much of her time and for being too much. She took both of my hands in hers, looked deep into my eyes, and said something that absolutely changed the way I saw myself and the trajectory of my life. She said, "I love spending time with you. I love you. If I could hang out with you more, I would. If I have the opportunity to spend time with you, my answer is always a resounding yes. I always want more CG in my life. And the people who really know you and love you feel the same way too." Now, I don't remember how I responded. I likely brushed it off or downplayed it, if I'm being honest. It felt too real, too vulnerable to believe that anyone had a firm stance that more time with me would always be considered a good thing. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit with my paradigm. My life experience taught me to expect a but at the end of what she said to me, that she would tell me how I needed to change or to be better, or she would lob some cliche at me in hopes of making my pain go away, or that I needed to believe something that she happened to believe, of course, that would make the difference. I didn't know what to do with an unabashed outpouring of love that didn't require anything of me, didn't tell me to change, and didn't point out my flaws. There was no motivating factor for her to say what she said other than for me to feel loved, seen, and encouraged. She didn't expect me to change who I am. She didn't shame me for the struggles I faced. She didn't lead me to believe that she had all the answers. She simply showed up, expressed how she felt, and didn't set any expectations for me. In the moment, I couldn't really feel how powerful that was. But since I've sat with this memory over the years, it has lost the sharp edges of the pain I was feeling at the moment. And what remains is a shining example of how healing relationships can be. In fact, when I feel self-conscious in social situations or I'm doubting myself, I remind myself of this conversation with her, that there are people out there who always want more time with me, not less. This reminder has helped undo the mental pattern that I had. This reminder has helped me undo the mental pattern that I had that told me that I needed too much from other people and that they see me as a burden. Slowly but surely, I am rewiring my brain to see that me being me is exactly what the world needs and is something that I am trying to pay forward to other people as well. And even though we may want to believe otherwise, the majority of what we spend our time on is insignificant in comparison to how we interact with other people. Forming deep, healthy connections with others is what gives life its sparkle. It's where you find the magic. It's where we can flourish and grow, even in the most challenging of circumstances. When you have healthy relationships, everything else can either be weathered or be celebrated. Sadly, most survivors of sexual violence struggle with relationship health. They've either never experienced it or it's been such a long time that they don't even know how to get back there. Today, we are talking about relational health in our Survivors Have Paid Enough series. This is episode 8 of the series, where we explore 8 areas of health and dive into how survivors of sexual violence have all areas of their lives impacted by the trauma they've experienced. We started the series by exploring how mental health is affected by sexual violence and taking a very deep dive into PTSD. We then began unpacking emotional health and what it looks like to feel big emotions and practice good emotional hygiene. For this episode, we are exploring how our relationships have impacted by surviving sexual violence. We are going to look at how survivors end up in a situation where they don't have many or potentially any healthy relationships, the feelings of isolation, and how to tell if a person or a community is safe. So, why do relationships feel like such a mess? Well, to be fair, relationships are tough for all of us. We all have our own baggage and assumptions based on our life experiences. As we talked about last month, unless we've specifically done the work, we have not learned good emotional hygiene. And as we know, no one wants to be around somebody with bad hygiene. We struggle to interact with others in a positive way. We end up talking at each other or to each other instead of with each other. And this is the baseline of how the majority of our society is structured at the moment. And disconnection breeds more disconnection. That is why it is our work at LTS as survivors and as people to learn how to be more connected with ourselves and with each other. There is so much healing that comes from fostering deep connections. But things are not in a good way when it comes to our relationships right now across the board. And I don't think anyone would be surprised by this sentiment. Now, pile on top of that deep, intense trauma. This is where survivors are. You may remember from previous podcasts that 80% of survivors know their perpetrator. These are family members, friends, members of their faith communities, neighbors, fellow students, roommates, you name it. It's people who flow in and out of their lives on a regular basis. It's people that other people in their lives avoid, tolerate, or revere, but they are there nonetheless. And as part of the grooming process, the gaslighting leads a person to believe that they can't trust themselves to know what healthy behaviors are. It's a frog in a slow boil where the abusers teach their victims how to tolerate abuse, slowly but surely. Abusers often isolate their victims, creating wedges in other relationships, or even going so far as to physically isolate them from their support systems. The survivors get all mixed up about who is safe and who isn't. There's a further layer to this as well, one that is often challenging to come to terms with. When a person is in an abusive situation, the other people in their lives fit into one of 5 different categories. So one is that other people are also abusers. The second option is that other people are facilitating the abuse, which can also mean simply choosing to look the other way instead of facing the reality that part of them knows exists. A third option is that other people are distant enough, whether physically, emotionally, or relationally, that they aren't effectively part of the person being abused actual support system. The fourth option is that the other people are being abused themselves, or the other people are intentionally attempting to support the abused person and to help give them resources to get out of the situation. So when a person experiences sexual violence or other long-term abuses perpetrated by the people in their lives, this means that every other person is either perpetrating more abuse, can't effectively help them, or are actively attempting to help. Sadly, when survivors look back at those who were in our lives at the times we experienced sexual violence, we often see people who had the ability to help put it to an end and chose not to. We also see people that we love and care about who are being affected by the harm too. And this is its own set of wounds to work through. Going through something as traumatic as sexual violence is obviously devastating. But then to realize that there were people who could have done something and then chose not to is a heartbreak layered on top of the devastation. Or to see the ripple effects of the harm through many, many people that we care about. And then to layer even more complication on top of that, there are people in the survivor's life who are sometimes in more than one category. Coming to terms with the notion that there was a person in our life who was facilitating the abuse while also being abused themselves takes a huge amount of work from the survivor to have the emotional and psychological resilience to manage holding those truths at the same time. No wonder why relationships feel like such a minefield to survivors sometimes. On top of learning a brutal lesson that the people we thought we could trust are capable of committing violent crimes against us, we see that other people could have stopped it and didn't. Naturally, there's a drawing away from others that happens in the face of these betrayals. And to address the survivors who don't know the perpetrator, these attacks still often happen in familiar places, at work, near their homes, in their neighborhoods. It's common for it to be in a place where the person often is, around people who are commonly there. Even though it's not necessarily a specific person in their life who they are familiar with, it is often in circumstances that are familiar. Suddenly, they are pushed out of the comfortable and the routine into feelings of being incredibly unsafe because they no longer know if the people around them will cause them harm. And this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So even when a survivor is attacked by a person they don't know, they often end up pulling away from most relationships in their lives initially. The prevailing internal message is that they need to isolate in order to be safe, that other people are a danger to their well-being. It's only with time and consistent demonstrations that a person is truly safe, that a survivor can trust them and untangle that knot. For now, I'm going to go back to addressing the majority of survivors who do know their attackers. Frequently, as survivors start doing this work, they end up with feeling more isolated as they recognize the relative level of unhealth in their relationships. When living with long-term abuse, the expectations of how we are treated become deeply ingrained neurologically. Even when we are out of the abuse, these neural expectations are still there for how other people will treat us. And as we begin to heal, we see how many of the relationships in our lives are continuing to harm us in similar patterns, and we have to create space for ourselves. It can feel incredibly lonely. But like so many parts of healing, step 1 is awareness. Step 2 is getting rid of what we no longer want for ourselves. And then step 3 is building what we do want for ourselves. And step 2 is always the hardest. We don't see the positive outcomes yet. We are smack dab in the middle of seeing the struggle. Taking steps to address it doesn't take the pain away immediately, but it does make it go away in the long term. It's not easy, but it begins to build a greater level of ease into one's life. And this is why it is so key to have trauma-specific mental health care like EMDR. EMDR is designed to reprocess the neural expectations that we have to create new, healthy expectations. Though challenging certainly in its own right, it allows us to much more rapidly address the beliefs that we have and instill the new ones that we want. So now we're going to move into the discussion about how to tell if a person or a community is safe. But there are some important things to note. First, we cannot change other people's behaviors. I'm going to repeat that for the people in the back. We cannot change other people's behaviors. Sure, we can give them feedback. We can provide our insights. We can share our experiences. But how they choose to interact with that information is their prerogative. As much as we might want them to approach us differently, we cannot force that into reality. Each of us has to choose for ourselves how we show up in the world, and the way we demonstrate our values is through our behaviors. So if you see someone showing some red flags, you can share your experiences with them, but they get to decide if they will course correct or not. If they choose not to, they have indicated that they do not have your best interest at heart. The flip side of that is that it takes time to change. If you share your experiences after seeing red flags, and the person is truly attempting to course correct, remember that it doesn't happen overnight. You need to show some patience with the process. But the patience is only warranted if they have demonstrated a commitment to becoming a safe person. Otherwise, patience that's not warranted is simply enabling the harmful behavior to continue to affect you. And as we approach determining safe or unsafe people and communities, we want to view these observations as discernment and to stay away from judgment. Discernment allows us to tap into our inner knowing, our true selves, to see what feels like it's promoting health, connection, peace, and the other things that we are pursuing in our lives. At the beginning of this journey, hearing that intuition might be a challenge. So you can use tools like this list as a way to check in. This is also why it's incredibly helpful to work with an EMDR therapist. On the other hand, judgment looks at a certain set of behaviors in someone else and assigns a value to that person based on these behaviors. This creates further disconnection from people and not something that we want to perpetuate. The point of this exercise is not to point out what's wrong with other people. It is to be able to better understand who helps us feel the most healthy, vibrant, and peaceful, and then take action based on that recognition. All right, additional explanation over. Let's jump in. First, we're going to look at how to tell if a person is safe. So, they provide a space for healing, community, and connection. They are able to identify and articulate emotions. They can hold space for the messy parts of life. They do not automatically try to make big problems go away by going into problem-solving mode or giving advice. They respect the dignity of all people, regardless of if they hold the same beliefs, values, principles, etc. They are able to push back or disagree with others kindly and respectfully and have beneficial outcomes. They are willing to empathize or understand another person's experiences. They ask good questions and approach others with curiosity. They promote healthy boundaries and the autonomy of everyone. For communities, All of what I just said is true about the community at large, as well as each individual in the group. But on top of those individual and group characteristics, the way to tell a community is safe by having a list of common values and or guidelines for how people treat each other in the group. Group discussions are facilitated by people being authentic, and group interactions promote the health of all who are involved. On the other hand, these are some potential red flags to tell that a person or a community is not safe. If the primary goal is theological, political, or ideological buy-in, people attempt to control other people. Use of cliches in response to emotional topics. The use of spiritual or intellectual bypass to avoid emotions. For those of you unfamiliar with this concept, a good example of this is when sharing something deep or personal, and the person responds by talking about an article that they read about that topic. Then we're going to go into this more in another episode. Don't you worry. Another potential demonstration of a red flag is not creating space for people to bring their full selves, demonizing entire groups of people, judging others, or making sweeping statements about people they may or may not have ever even met. An unwillingness or inability to be vulnerable. Participants going into fix-it mode when someone shares something challenging. Trying to get people to fit a mold or expectations of conformity. Use of the phrase, "I can't imagine." This is a common one, but it also creates disconnection between people because the speaker is saying that they are actively choosing not to empathize. This is also something we will discuss more in another episode. Another potential red flag is people telling you the answer about your situation or your life, and generally erodes boundaries and doesn't promote individual autonomy. Now, if you heard this list of red flags and thought, uh-oh, I know I've done some of these things, congratulations. You've gained awareness about how you interact with others. This doesn't make you a bad person. It means that you haven't connected to yourself or to others in a way to see how your behavior impacts them. And the good news is that you can begin to make those changes today. As survivors practice building relationships and being in communities, we may find ourselves not being the safe ones. This is often the case. But this is the beauty and the pain of becoming more self-aware. We take the steps we can to get healthier, to make amends, and be willing to approach things differently in the future. Again, changing behaviors takes a huge amount of time, energy, and dedication. It's repeatedly making the decision over and over to do something a different way. Be kind and gracious with yourself as you navigate this healing. As you use your discernment to identify how your interactions with others are going, you will feel more confident in your ability to recognize what you want to keep incorporating into your life. If and when you realize that there is someone in your life that is particularly damaging, you get to decide how you want to interact with that information. You get to decide what boundaries you need to be able to stay in a healthy and grounded place. And other people get to decide to respect those boundaries or continue to treat you poorly. Then you get to decide what steps you want to take if someone consistently crashes those boundaries. What's key here is that you get to decide. If someone else is trying to convince you that you are required to be in a relationship with someone else, that is not helpful to anyone. You get to face both the joys and the consequences of taking the steps towards your health. Some people will likely push back and try to get you to conform to the way you were before. And again, You get to decide what you want to do with that. The trouble lies in when we are so disconnected from ourselves and others that we don't realize that we have a choice and we aren't actively making choices. Each person in each relationship has equal value, dignity, and worth. Each person should have full autonomy over themselves and their lives. Each person deserves a life full of people who love and respect them. And for the person listening to this who isn't sure, I also mean you. You deserve relationships where people cherish you and celebrate you exactly as you are. And then they celebrate your growth and changes. They sit with you in your pain and frustrations. They allow you to show all parts of who you are without judgment. You deserve all the wonderful and beautiful things that come from people who truly know and accept you. This is what I hope for each and every one of us, that we take the steps towards healthy relationships, that we listen to ourselves when something feels off and take steps towards what feels right, that we practice deep connection with ourselves and with each other. Yes, this is true for survivors. This is part of the onerous healing process that survivors endure after the trauma that they faced. But this is true for all of us. The world will be a better place when we focus on connecting with each other instead of being right or needing other people to believe what we believe. It is allowing ourselves to be open with the people who have demonstrated that this will be a good thing. It's showing up with grace, kindness, and curiosity. It's being kind to ourselves when we don't live up to the standards that we've set for ourselves, and taking the necessary steps to repair damage we've caused. I want us to imagine something together. If you can, close your eyes. Imagine a world where you wake up every morning knowing that the people you will talk to that day will add vibrancy and joy to your life. Imagine a world where people walk around with their eyes shining and bright instead of dull, withdrawn, or perpetually glued to their phones. Imagine a world where we can disagree and it has no impact on the depth of connection we have with the other person. Just imagine. And this is my encouragement to each of us right now, today. Take a step today to be the person who provides healthy relationships to others. Seek out others who prioritize the same. I promise you, friends, this will change the world because it changes us. And we can do this. Thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter. Or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. We'll see you next month.